Welcome to the Deck Dive, the place we take a stack of sources, tear down complex scientific ideas, and build them back up with surprising context and real insight. Today, we are focusing on the very foundation of our existence, the Earth's crust. It is the thin, solid shell that supports every mountain, ocean, and city, and yet we rarely give it a second thought. Here's the mind-bending fact we need to start with. The Earth's crust, the entire thickness of the rock we interact with, comprises less than 1% of the planet's total volume. Less than 1% of the radius, too. I mean, if the Earth were an apple, the crust would be thinner than the skin. It's almost nothing. Our mission in this deep dive is to understand this incredible thin veneer. We are going beyond the basic definition to explore its dual personality, how it's chemically distinct from the mantle, why some parts are ancient survivors and others are constantly recycled, and how physics dictates why our dry land is dramatically higher than the deep ocean floor. So, to set the stage, let's nail down where the crust sits in the planet's architecture. It is the solid, outermost rock shell, but it is only the top component of a much larger, rigid structure called the lithosphere. This lithosphere is the entire tectonic plate itself. It includes the crust and the rigid, cool, uppermost layer of the mantle right beneath it. This whole structure, broken into plates, is the mechanism through which the Earth regulates its internal temperature. It lets the deep heat escape.
That distinction is absolutely vital because it changes how you view the solid surface of the Earth. Why should you care about this less than 1% fraction of the planet? Because its very existence and stability depend on a delicate balance. The crust, well, it floats on the mantle below it.
Floats. How does solid rock float?
Well, float is maybe a bit simplistic, but it captures the idea. It's possible because of the material science. The underlying upper mantle is primarily made of a rock called peridotite, and peridotite is extremely dense, far denser than anything that forms the crust. This density differential provides the necessary buoyancy for the entire crust and the rest of the lithosphere to sit in a stable configuration. You were talking about a contrast almost like the difference between a dense iron block and a piece of granite floating on a very, very viscous liquid, slow motion floating over millions of years.
That helps us visualize the structure, but how do scientists define the literal line where the crust ends and the mantle begins? It can't be a fuzzy transition, or plate tectonics wouldn't work so predictably, right?
No, it's not fuzzy at all. It's defined by a specific, measurable physical contrast called the Mohorovicic discontinuity.
Right, the MOHO.
The MOHO for short, thankfully. And the MOHO isn't defined by just temperature or pressure. It's defined by a sudden change in how quickly seismic waves, earthquake waves, travel through the rock.
Ah, okay, so waves travel differently through different stuff.
Exactly. When a seismic wave hits the MOHO, its velocity sharply increases. This increase in velocity tells seismologists that the wave has moved from the less dense crustal material into the significantly denser peridotite of the mantle. It's a literal acoustic boundary layer. We know precisely where this layer is because we can detect that change in speed, which provides indisputable evidence of a massive change in rock density and composition deep below our feet.
Okay, let's unpack this in terms of temperature then. If we start drilling down from the surface, which is comfortably cool, how quickly do conditions change? How hot does the crust actually get before we hit that dense peridotite layer, the mantle?
It gets hot, fast. We tend to think of the surface as fixed, but the temperature of the crust increases dramatically with depth.
Right at the MOHO boundary, the rock can reach a massive range, typically 100 degrees C, in areas where the crust is thin and cold, maybe under old ocean basins. Up to 600 degrees C, or 1112 degrees, in areas where there is active volcanism or tectonic stretching. That's hot enough to melt lead easily. This huge thermal stress tells us the crust is not just a passive shell, it's cooking.
Yeah, and what's truly fascinating is the rate of heat increase, the thermal gradient. In the upper crust, that gradient is incredibly rapid. You can see the temperature locally increase by as much as 30 degrees C or 54 degrees for every single kilometer you descend.
30 degrees per kilometer, that's steep. Why so fast near the surface?
Well, it's because the continental crust, in particular, contains higher concentrations of radioactive elements like uranium, thorium, and potassium. These elements decay, and that decay process generates heat right there in the crust itself. It's like having little heaters embedded in the rock. This intense thermal gradient is critical. It drives geothermal activity. It helps create veins of mineral deposits. It's the key energy source for metamorphic processes, literally cooking and transforming the rocks of the lower crust.
So we have this thin, hot layer sitting atop an incredibly dense substrate. That density difference, as you mentioned, is the fundamental physics governing the whole system.
Absolutely. If the crust didn't float, we wouldn't have plate tectonics as we know it. The crust is less dense than the mantle, and this physical reality is why we have mountains and continents. This principle is called isostasy. It basically refers to the state of gravitational equilibrium between the Earth's lithosphere and the mantle beneath it, like balancing blocks.
Isostasy sounds complex, but you're saying it really dictates global geography.
Yeah.
It's the reason why mountains have deep roots, similar to how an iceberg only shows, what, 10% above the water?
Precisely. Think of isostasy as Archimedes' principle applied on a planetary scale. It explains why a massive slab of continental crust rides significantly higher than a slab of oceanic crust. Both are lighter than the mantle, sure, but because they have different characteristics, specifically thickness and internal density, they achieve radically different states of equilibrium. And that determines whether the surface is dry land or deep ocean.
Right. And here's where we get to the core distinction, Earth doesn't just have one crust, it has two dramatically different types. The thick, ancient continental crust and the thin, constantly recycled oceanic crust. They are a physical and chemical study in contrasts, and they are responsible for pretty much every major geographical feature on the planet. Let's start with the continental crust, the stuff that makes up our land masses. Its profile is one of immense variability and scale.
Yeah, continental crust is thick. It ranges wildly from maybe 25 kilometers up to 70 kilometers, or about 15 to 44 miles thick.
That variability is driven entirely by tectonic history, isn't it? Where continents have crashed together, the crust has wrinkled and stacked up on itself like a rug pushed against a wall.
Exactly. And we see the most extreme examples of that stacking under the planet's largest mountain ranges. Consider the Tibetan Plateau, where the Indian and Eurasian plates have collided. There, the crust is ballooned out to between 50 and 80 kilometers thick.
80 kilometers.
80 kilometers. To put that into perspective, that's roughly the distance from, say, New York City to Trenton, New Jersey. You would have to drive that entire distance down just to penetrate the crust under the Tibetan Plateau. It's a colossal amount of material that has been crumpled and compressed over tens of millions of years.
And compositionally, this stacked material is significantly less dense than the mantle, which is key. It is composed primarily of felsic rocks, that's a geological term for rocks rich in lighter elements like silicon, oxygen, aluminum, and potassium. The most famous example being granite. This low density is the secret to its long-term survival.
Right. And we even have a tight estimate for its overall bulk.
Yeah.
The average density is estimated at about 2.835 grams per cubic centimeter. But, and this is a critical nuance, the density is not uniform. It actually increases significantly as you descend through the crust.
Okay, why does it get denser deeper down?
That density gradient is a key insight. You start around 2.66 GC-meter at the surface, where granites and sedimentary rocks dominate, and it increases to about 3.1 GC-meter at the Moa boundary. Why the increase? Two primary reasons. First, the intense pressure forces minerals into denser, more tightly packed crystal structures, squeezes them. Second, the composition fundamentally changes. While we often call continental crust granitic, the average composition is actually closer to andesite. The upper crust is indeed more felsic, resembling dacite maybe, but the lower crust, which is hotter and under immense pressure, becomes more mafic, richer in magnesium and iron, resembling basalt or gabbro. This lower, denser part of the crust is the transition zone, kind of locking the crust onto the mantle.
Okay, now let's flip the switch and look at the oceanic crust to appreciate the true scale of the contrast. It's like the inverse of everything we just described.
Exactly. The oceanic crust is thin and wonderfully predictable, geologically speaking. It measures only about 5 to 10 kilometers thick, a tiny fraction of the continental crust. This thinness is a consequence of its continuous efficient process of creation at mid-ocean ridges.
And compositionally, it is dense and mafic, rich in magnesium and iron. Its primary rock types are basalt, diabase, and gabbro. It's the dark, heavy stuff.
The fast-moving component of the system, yeah. And we know its internal structure extremely well, thanks to decades of deep-sea drilling and seismic analysis. It forms in 3 specific layers atop the mantle. The uppermost layer is a thin veneer of deep-sea sediments, muds and oozes. Below that are layers 2A and 2B, consisting of pillow lava first, then sheeted dikes underneath. These are basically the solidified plumbing system where magma rose from the ridge, all with a composition of mid-ocean ridge basalt, or MORB.
Like frozen pipes of magma. And the final, deepest layer of the oceanic crust.
That's layer 3, which is composed entirely of gabbro. Gabbro is chemically identical to basalt, but it cooled and crystallized slowly deep underground, forming larger crystals. This whole layered structure is the physical signature of seafloor spreading. You see it everywhere new ocean floor is made.
So if we bring it back to that critical concept of isostasy, what does this huge difference in composition and thickness mean for the planet's geography?
It means everything for geography. The continental crust is thicker and less dense overall. This combination gives it superior buoyancy. Think of two pieces of wood floating in water. A large, thick piece of balsa wood, maybe, that's the continental crust, and then compare it to a small, thin piece of oak, which is the oceanic crust. Even though both float, the balsa wood sits much higher above the waterline because it displaces more volume while having lower density.
That analogy perfectly explains why continents form high ground, often referred to as continental platforms, while the denser, thinner oceanic crust sinks down into equilibrium, forming the abyssal plains, the deep ocean basins that surround our landmasses. The geography of Earth isn't random, it's dictated entirely by the physics of these two floating crust types. Amazing.
It really is. It's elegant physics playing out on a massive scale.
Moving on from the structure, let's dive into the core ingredients. We know the crust is chemically unique from the mantle, but what exactly is this highly refined rock made of? Let's conduct an elemental deep dive into the bulk of the continental crust.
Okay. When we look at the abundance by weight, the results are rather surprising because the vast majority of our crust is made up of just 5 elements, and the top 2 are overwhelmingly dominant.
Number 1, the champion of the crust is oxygen, making up a massive 46.1% of the crust by weight. This is often confusing to non-geologists, but remember, oxygen is the O in SiO2, silica, and the O in almost every major silicate mineral. It's locked in the rocks.
Exactly. It's not atmospheric oxygen we're breathing, it's chemically bonded oxygen atoms in the crystalline structure of the rocks. Following oxygen is silicon at 28.2%. Together, these two elements, the constituents of silica, account for well over 70% of the crust's mass. It's basically a silicate world.
The rest of the major 5 include aluminum at 8.23%, iron at 5.63%, and calcium at 4.15%.
And that's pretty much it. When you factor in sodium, magnesium, potassium, titanium, and all the trace elements, everything else, excluding water totals less than 1%, it's a highly concentrated recipe. This extreme concentration of silicates means the most abundant minerals are, unsurprisingly, the ones built from these elements.
Like what? What are the top minerals?
The most common mineral family by far is the feldspars, making up about 41% of the crust by weight. All sorts of feldspars. Then you have quartz, which is pure silica at 12%, and pyroxenes at 11%. Knowing those 3 groups means you understand the building blocks of most rocks you'll find on Earth's surface.
Now, let's talk about the missing ingredients. What's truly fascinating from a planetary science perspective is not what we have, but what we don't have much of. Specifically, elements classify as siderophile or iron-loving, things like gold and platinum.
Exactly. If you look at the composition of meteorites material representing the primitive composition of the solar system, they are relatively rich in elements like gold, platinum, iridium, and nickel. Yet on Earth's crust, these elements are incredibly rare and highly valued. Why the difference?
It goes back to the early Earth, right? The molten state.
Yes, the explanation is the core of the planet itself. When early Earth was a molten magma ocean, planetary differentiation occurred. Heavy iron sunk to this center to form the core. Because siderophile elements have a chemical affinity for iron, they were effectively scavenged from the surface layers and relocated deeper into the Earth's interior alongside the sinking iron. They went down with the iron.
That is a staggering planetary scale separation process. The crust is, quite literally, the residue left over after the formation of the core siphoned off the iron lovers.
Absolutely. It's chemical refining on a planetary scale.
This depletion explains why gold, for instance, is measured in parts per billion in the crust, requiring intensive mining and concentration processes to be commercially viable. The planet's largest potential gold repository isn't somewhere like Nevada or South Africa. It's the outer core.
That's absolutely right. You'd have a hard time mining it, though. And this leads to another fascinating theory, the late veneer hypothesis. It suggests that the meager supply of these precious metals we do find in the crust actually arrived after core formation was complete, delivered by a final bombardment of asteroids and meteorites after the planet had mostly cooled and solidified its surface. If not for that cosmic late delivery, precious metals will be even rarer.
Wow. So our gold rings are basically alien leftovers.
In a manner of speaking, yes.
Yeah.
Leftovers from the solar system's formation that arrived late.
Okay, beyond the siderophiles, we need to discuss elements that exhibit a quality called incompatibility. This sounds technical, but it's a key insight into how continental crust is chemically refined.
Yeah, incompatible is a useful term. Incompatible elements are those whose atomic size or charge prevents them from easily fitting into the crystal structures of common mantle minerals, particularly olivine and pyroxene, when those minerals crystallize from a magma. Because the mantle minerals reject them, these incompatible elements tend to get concentrated in the remaining liquid melt. When that melt eventually rises towards the surface and cools to form crustal rocks, all those rejected elements are concentrated there.
So the crust acts like the planet's chemical scum layer, collecting all the stuff the mantle didn't want.
Well, scum layer isn't very flattering, but chemically, that's kind of the idea. It's where the misfits end up. The difference in enrichment is striking. The continental crust is massively enriched in these incompatible elements, elements like uranium, thorium, potassium, rare earth elements, by a factor of 50 to 100 times compared to the primitive mantle rock. Oceanic crust is also enriched, but only by a factor of about 10. Continental crust really scoops them up.
And the practical consequence of this enrichment, particularly for uranium, thorium, and potassium, is enormous. It means the continental crust generates its own heat internally through radioactive decay.
Exactly, which connects back to what we said earlier.
This internal heat generation is what contributes to that steep thermal gradient we discussed, making the continental crust less thermally stable perhaps, but also providing the energy for long-term processes like metamorphism and helping maintain its buoyancy by keeping it warm and slightly less rigid. The oceanic crust, lacking this level of radioactive enrichment, is much colder and denser overall.
Correct. And finally, just a footnote on rarity. Two other elements, tellurium and selenium, are also scarce in the crust, but probably not because of the core. They were likely depleted because they formed highly volatile hydrides compounds with hydrogen. These would have escaped early in Earth's history as gases, potentially lost to space before the crust fully solidified and the atmosphere became more stable.
Okay, so we have detailed this highly refined, chemically unique shell, but how did it get here? Now we jump into the timeline, tracing the incredible, violent evolution of the crust from a molten planetary state to the stable landscape we have today.
Yeah, this is where the story gets really dynamic.
We have to begin at the very beginning, 4.6 billion years ago. The Earth formed through accretion planetesimals, basically small protoplanets colliding and sticking together. The energy released by these catastrophic collisions was so immense that early Earth melted completely, becoming a massive planetary magma ocean, just a ball of molten rock.
Hard to even imagine. And as that incredible heat dissipated and the planet began to cool, a skin formed on this magma ocean, its first attempt at a crust. We call it the primary or primordial crust. However, this crust, likely basaltic in composition, was destined for failure.
Why failure?
It faced continuous destruction. Imagine large, late-stage impacts from leftover debris that would re-liquefy massive segments of the surface. Combine that with fierce early erosion, maybe a denser atmosphere, and the initial chaotic stages of plate tectonic activity starting up. The critical detail for you to remember is that none of Earth's primary crust survives today. It was all destroyed, melted, and recycled back into the mantle during the Hadean Eon, the planet's first half-billion years.
So total reset. Once that initial phase of extreme violence subsided, the planet settled into a more constant, predictable cycle of creation and destruction. This led to what we call the secondary crust, which is essentially equivalent to the modern oceanic crust.
That's right. This secondary crust is constantly forming today at mid-ocean spreading centers. Here, the underlying mantle experiences partial melting. This melt, being basaltic magma, rises to fill the gap created by the separating plates, creating brand new ocean floor. This process is highly efficient and is a primary driver of plate movement, often referred to as ridge push. It literally pushes the plates apart.
But Earth is a closed system, more or less. If we constantly create new oceanic crust at these ridges,
we must destroy old crust at an equal rate somewhere else. Balance the budget.
Right. And that destruction happens at subduction zones.
Exactly. These are deep ocean trenches where the denser, colder, older ocean plate sinks back down into the hot mantle below. As it sinks, it heats up, releases water, melts, hydrates the overlying mantle wedge, and its material is eventually recycled back into the deeper mantle.
It's a planetary recycling program.
A very efficient one. This constant, efficient recycling process imposes a strict age limit on the oceanic crust. Because it is continuously consumed at subduction zones, the oldest oceanic crust we can find on the seafloor today is only about 200 million years old. To a geologist, that is shockingly young, just a small chapter in Earth's 4.6 billion year history. Dinosaurs walked on crust older than the oldest seafloor we have now.
Okay, so that's the young, fast-moving oceanic crust. Now we transition to the true survivor, the tertiary crust, which is the continental crust. This material acts as the planet's geological record keeper because it is designed to last.
And the age difference is just staggering. While the oldest seafloor is 200 million years, the oldest continental crustal rocks are preserved in ancient, incredibly stable regions called cratons. We find these stable cores or shields all over the world, like the Acasta gneiss in Canada or the Narrier gneiss terrane in Western Australia.
And how old are these rocks?
These rocks date back between 3.7 and 4.28 billion years. Think about that. This is material that existed when there was likely little to no free oxygen in the atmosphere, and life was just maybe single cells barely getting started.
That's incredible, almost back to the beginning.
Almost. And researchers analyzing tiny, extremely resistant crystals of the mineral zircon within the Narrier gneiss terrane have pushed the absolute age record even further. They've found individual zircon grains as old as 4.3 billion years. That means those tiny crystals crystallized when the planet was just 300 million years old. They are the closest thing we have to a physical relic of the Hadean Eon, like tiny time capsules.
And even if we set aside those record-breaking fragments, the estimated average age of the entire current continental crust is still profoundly old, about 2.0 billion years. It's the permanent, enduring component of Earth's surface.
So this raises the single most important question, really. Why? Why does the continental crust survive for billions of years while the oceanic crust is destroyed every couple 100 million years? What is the mechanism of survival?
It must come down to how it's made and its properties, right? That buoyancy again.
Exactly. The survival mechanism is twofold: how it's made and its inherent buoyancy. Continental crust is formed primarily at subduction zones, but not directly from the sinking plate melting entirely. Instead, the subducting oceanic crust releases water into the mantle wedge above it. Water acts like a flux, lowers the melting point. Precisely. That water lowers the melting point of the mantle rock, causing it to undergo what geologists call flux melting. This generates magma that is chemically different from the sinking basalt. It's always a step removed. Then, through a process called fractional crystallization, as this magma rises and cools, minerals crystallize out in sequence. The remaining melt becomes progressively enriched in lighter felsic components. It's effectively taking dense basaltic material and chemically refining it into lighter, granite-like material. This is why arc volcanoes, like those ringing the Pacific in the Ring of Fire, often erupt andesitic or dacitic material, which are the building blocks of continents.
So continental crust is chemically optimized to be light and buoyant from the very start. And once it forms, it resists recycling entirely.
Exactly. The key to preservation lies in those ancient cratons we mentioned. Most crustal rocks formed before 2.5 billion years ago are located in these cratons, and they possess what geologists call deep, cold lithospheric roots. This isn't just the crust, it's the mantle part of the plate underneath it too.
Ah, so the whole plate under the craton is special.
Yes, this old continental crust, and crucially, the lithospheric mantle root right beneath it, are together less dense and much more rigid than the mantle elsewhere. Because they are less dense overall, they are incredibly buoyant and thick-acting, like giant, permanent, unsinkable rafts anchored deep in the mantle, maybe hundreds of kilometers deep.
Okay, so that's the definitive answer to the survival question. These photonic blocks simply float too high and are too light and stable to be forced down into the subduction zones. They resist being destroyed by the very process that helps create new continental material, allowing them to endure for eons.
That's the core idea. They are survivors by their very nature.
And we can clearly link the formation and consolidation of this buoyant tertiary crust to the great geological cycles of the Earth. The creation of new continental mass seems to coincide with periods of intense orogeny, which is the technical term for the process of mountain building.
Absolutely. These major mountain building events are tied to the assembly of supercontinents like Rodinia, Pangaea, and Gondwana throughout Earth's history. When these continents collide, they generate huge amounts of heat and pressure. They stack the crust up incredibly thick, like in the Himalayas today. And these collisions often trigger massive pulses of magma generation, derived from that flux melting process, which contribute to new, stable crustal volume that gets added to the edges of the cratons. The formation and preservation of continents are synchronized with the rhythmic breathing of the planet's tectonic engine, the supercratonid cycle.
And the consequences of this entire dynamic system, the constant formation, destruction, and movement of these plates governed by density and heat, is what we experience daily, sometimes dramatically. Movement within the continental crust manifests as powerful earthquakes on land, and movement on the seabed, especially at subduction zones, creates the terrifying forces behind tsunamis or tidal waves. It's all a consequence of the planet trying to release its internal heat through this thin, dynamic shell.
Yeah, it's the planet staying active, shedding heat.
So let's wrap up this deep dive by just reviewing the sheer scale and importance of what we've discussed. The Earth's habitable life support system is housed in a shell that constitutes less than 1% of its volume. Yet this shell is chemically refined to hold a stunning 46% oxygen and 28% silicon by weight, the key ingredients for rocks and, indirectly, life.
And we have seen the dramatic dual nature of this planetary skin. There's the thin, dense, young oceanic crust constantly being recycled every 200 million years or so, serving as the raw material generator. And then we have the thick, buoyant, ancient continental crust, the eternal survivor, which preserves rocks dating back as far as 4.3 billion years. And it dictates the geography of our planet through its stubborn resistance to sinking.
This constant, vast planetary cycle driven by internal heat, the creation and destruction of crust, is only possible because the continental crust found a mechanism to survive.
Which leads to a final provocative thought for you to mull over. Consider this. If the process of fractional crystallization at subduction zones had been slightly less efficient, meaning the early continental cratons and their underlying lithospheric mantle roots had formed just a little bit denser and therefore slightly less buoyant, what would the visible surface of Earth look like today? Would the world be entirely covered by a single global ocean, with no significant land masses ever surviving above sea level? Would complex land life even have evolved? Something to think about.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're really getting stuck into something huge, intellectually speaking. One of the most famous and maybe most misunderstood concepts from Carl Jung.
That's right, the collective unconscious.
Exactly. We've got your source materials here, the articles, historical bits, modern critiques. And our job, really, is to give you that psychological shortcut you need. We're exploring this idea that part of your mind deep down isn't really about your life experiences at all. It's something inherited, something built up over the entire history of, humanity.
Precisely. And when Jung first put a name to it, collectives, Unbewusstes, that's the term he used to have, with this universal layer. It's not personal.
Right.
It's a repository deep within us all. And it's not just, shared cultural things. He meant something innate, made up of basic human instincts and, maybe most famously, the Jungian archetypes.
Archetypes. We'll definitely get into those.
Yeah, these pre-existing forms, universal symbols, things we're basically born understanding how to recognize on some level.
Okay, so that's our mission for this deep dive. We're going to define the key parts, archetypes, instincts. We'll look at the evidence Jung used, especially that big aha moment he had in the clinic.
The Mithras case, yeah.
And really importantly, we've got to tackle the critiques, the big questions about whether the stuff is truly inherited or if it's more about, shared environments, nature versus nurture, essentially.
It's a crucial distinction.
So let's unpack this whole framework. And I think we have to start where Jung himself started to diverge, right? The break with Freud.
Absolutely fundamental. Freud's whole world was pretty much the personal unconscious.
Right. That's where all your specific stuff goes, the memories you forgot, desires you pushed down, your unique hang-ups and traumas.
Exactly. Your personal baggage, so to speak. But for Jung, that just wasn't enough. It didn't explain everything he was seeing.
You thought it was too shallow.
In a way, yes. He felt the personal unconscious was just the surface layer, like a thin film. He proposed this whole second psychic system, much deeper, much older. And this system, the collective unconscious, it underlies everything personal. It surrounds it. And crucially, it's universal. It's the same in me and you and someone from a completely different culture, different time.
Regardless of education background.
Irrelevant. Even personal neuroses don't change that fundamental layer. It's impersonal.
Okay, that is a really radical shift, because if that collective layer is real, it completely knocks down the whole idea of the mind as a tabula rasa.
Oh, absolutely.
Destroys it.
The blank slate idea, just gone.
Completely. The core idea here is that your individual mind isn't just shaped by experience, it's heavily, heavily influenced by these inherited predispositions.
So not learned behavior we all pick up,
Yeah.
but actual inherited structures. Yes. Jung wasn't talking about, things we learn together as a society. He meant inheriting the actual psychic life, the mental framework of our ancestors. He literally said it comprises the psychic life of our ancestors right back to the earliest beginnings.
Wow. That sounds, well, it sounds pretty mystical when you put it like that, which might be why some modern folks use different terms.
That's true. You hear terms like autonomous psyche or objective psyche used more often in analytical psychology today, where you're trying to ground it a bit more, make it sound less out there.
Yeah, makes sense. And we should probably clarify this is not the same as collective consciousness, right?
Oh, completely different. Good point. Collective consciousness is all the surface stuff, what a society agrees on. The consensus reality, the trends, the fashionable ideas of the moment.
Like what everyone's talking about right now.
Exactly. Collective consciousness is what people think together. The collective unconscious is what the human species is together, fundamentally and across time.
Okay. And the whole point of this, the function, why does it matter?
Well, if we all share this deep layer, it means we share a kind of symbolic language. Jung thought this was the explanation for why you see the same incredibly complex themes popping up everywhere.
Like the hero's journey. Or flood myths.
Precisely. Showing up in ancient myths from cultures that had zero contact. How? For Jung, it wasn't diffusion. It was because the blueprint, the collective unconscious, was generating them independently from the same source.
That makes a strange kind of sense.
And this blueprint, it doesn't just sit there quietly. It actively influences how we behave, how we see the world. Jung believed people, especially when they're not very self-aware or under stress, end up sort of living out its symbols.
So these ancient patterns project themselves onto our modern lives.
Absolutely. Onto our relationships, our choices, our reactions. They're active.
Okay, this is where we need to dig into the actual components. You mentioned two main things, archetypes and instincts. Let's start with archetypes.
Right. Archetypes are the core content, you could say. But it's crucial to get this right. They aren't inherited images. You don't inherit a picture of the mother.
Okay, so what are they then?
They're inherited tendencies, or predispositions to perceive and react to the world in certain typical ways. Jung called them primordial images, or typical modes of apprehension. Think of them as empty forms that experience fills in.
Forms, waiting for content.
Sort of.
Yeah.
They belong to the absolute basic stock of the psyche. They developed over evolutionary time, phylogenetic time, way before any single individual exists.
Can you give an example? You mentioned the anima and animus earlier.
Yes, they're a great example. The animus, that's the sort of unconscious masculine principle within the female psyche. And the anima is the unconscious feminine principle within the male psyche.
So it's not just about gender roles we learn.
No. For Jung, these were fundamental inherited symbolic structures. They represent the interplay of these complementary energies throughout all of human history. It's built in. He really saw these structures as bridging that evolutionary history.
Right.
You make the analogy with the body, Well, our bodies carry remnants of our evolutionary past, like the appendix, right? Useless now, but inherited. Jung argued the psyche does the same. It brings the mind of our unknown ancestors, these ancient structures, into our current consciousness.
Ah, so the mind, like the body, is a kind of museum of its evolutionary journey.
Exactly his point, a museum of phylogenetic history, both physically and psychically.
That's a really powerful image. And you see how flexible a single archetype can be. Let's take the mother archetype. That seems straightforward, but it's way bigger than just your actual mom, isn't it?
Oh, vastly bigger. Its core symbolic meaning revolves around things like protection, nourishment, fertility, the source.
So it gets projected everywhere.
Everywhere. Onto people, obviously mothers, grandmothers, maybe a caring nurse. But also onto concepts. Think about paradise or the kingdom of God, or Mother Church.
Places too.
Definitely. The earth itself, the sea, a forest, a cave, a walled garden, objects, a cornucopia, a fountain, a vessel, even abstract symbols.
Like a mandala. How does that fit?
Because the mandala, the circle, often symbolizes wholeness, containment, protection. It offers that sense of encompassing safety, which taps right into the core of the mother archetype. It's the unifying principle of nurturing safety, projected outward.
Amazing how one core idea branches out. Okay, what about the second component, instincts?
Right, and they're totally intertwined with archetypes. Jung listed 5 main human instincts. He started with the most basic biological ones and moved towards the more, psychic ones.
Which are?
Hunger, sexuality, then activity, The drive to do things, then reflection, the drive to think and contemplate, and finally creativity, the drive to make new things, to shape the world.
And how do these relate to archetypes in humans? Is it different from animals?
Yeah, he thought so. In animals, instinct is often quite rigid, very programmed. Think about birds building nests. Human instincts, he felt, are more like general drives. They strongly influence us, but there's a lot more freedom in how we express them.
And the archetype.
The archetype is almost like the psychic image, the symbolic pattern that emerges alongside the instinctual urge. It gives form to the drive.
Okay, I think I need a clearer picture of that link. You mentioned an analogy Jung used, something about a moth.
Ah, yes, the yucca moth. It's a fantastic, really specific example he used. This little moth has this incredibly complex instinctual behavior.
What does it do?
On just one night of its entire life, it instinctively knows this precise ritual. It collects pollen from a yucca flower, rolls it into a specific pellet shape.
Okay.
Then it flies to a different yucca plant, makes a hole in the plant's ovary, lays its egg inside, and then this is the amazing part. It climbs up and deliberately pollinates that flower with the pollen pellet it brought.
Wow. All on instinct, it just knows.
Exactly. It's a perfectly choreographed sequence, totally innate, programmed.
So how does that relate back to humans, archetypes, and instincts?
Well, Jung saw archetypes and instincts as originally being completely fused, like in the moth. Interdependent opposites, he called them. The pattern, archetype, and the drive, instinct, were one thing.
But in humans?
In humans, he believed, something changed. The archetypes became sort of elevated. They developed into a separate register of mental life, capable of conscious awareness, reflection, symbolism. We don't just act on instinct, we can symbolize the drive, reflect on it, create art about it. The archetype allows for that meaning-making layer on top of the raw instinct.
Right. That clarifies the connection. So if this whole structure, instincts, archetypes is inherited, how did Jung actually try to, prove it? He was a clinician, right, working with patients.
Primarily, yes. He spent decades looking for evidence in his patients' experiences, mainly through dream analysis, looking for those universal patterns in dreams, and also through active imagination.
Active imagination. What's that?
It's a technique where you consciously engage with your fantasies, like having a dialogue with figures from your unconscious while awake, exploring the inner landscape deliberately.
Interesting. But was there one specific piece of clinical evidence that really convinced him? The aha moment.
Absolutely. The one that gets cited constantly is the Mithras liturgy case. It's probably the cornerstone of his early argument for the collective unconscious.
Okay, tell me about that.
Jung was working with a patient diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. This patient, who had no background in history or obscure mythology, started describing this very bizarre, very specific hallucination.
What did he see?
He said he looked at the sun, and hanging down from it was a kind of tube, like a phallus. And this tube was swinging back and forth, and its movement was what generated the wind.
Okay. That is incredibly specific and weird.
Extremely. Jung just noted it down at the time as part of the patient's psychosis. Didn't think much more of it.
Until
some time later, Jung happened to be reading a newly published academic translation of a text called the Mithras liturgy.
What's that?
It's an ancient Greco-Egyptian papyrus, part of the Greek magical papyri, likely connected to the mystery religion of Mithras. Very obscure stuff, especially back then, only recently deciphered and made available.
And don't leave me hanging.
And in this ancient obscure text, Jung found an exact description of his patient's hallucination. The text describes seeing a tube hanging down from the sun and states that its movement is the origin of the wind.
Wait, the exact same image. From a 2,000-year-old text the patient absolutely could not have seen.
Precisely. The text was brand new to scholarship. The patient had severe mental illness and was institutionalized. No way he encountered it.
That's more than just coincidence, isn't it?
That was Jung's absolute conviction. He concluded that neither the ancient priest who wrote the liturgy nor his schizophrenic patient invented that image independently.
So where did it come from?
It must have arisen spontaneously in both of them, centuries apart, from the same underlying universal inherited source, the collective unconscious.
Wow. Okay, I can see why that was a big moment for him.
It solidified his belief that mythology, ancient religions, even things like astrology, projecting symbolic figures onto the stars, weren't just quaint stories. They were projections, expressions of the collective unconscious trying to manifest itself.
So the collective unconscious is like this shared library of symbols that just keeps generating the same core ideas.
That's a good way to put it. And people have tried to test this idea, even though it's incredibly slippery, scientifically speaking. You mentioned a study, Rosen et al.
Yeah, from 1991. How on earth did they try to test something like inherited symbols in a lab?
Well, they moved away from grand myths and focused on basic cognitive processes like memory. They created something called an archetypal symbol inventory.
Okay.
They showed participants common, simple symbols like a circle, a square, a diamond, a triangle, and they paired these symbols with specific archetypal meanings drawn from Jungian theory. For instance, the diamond might be paired with the meaning self, the circle with wholeness, a snake with transformation, things like that.
Did the participants know these meanings?
No, that's the key. They had no conscious idea about the supposed Jungian meaning attached to each symbol. They just saw symbol word pairs. And the finding was pretty interesting. Subjects consistently showed better memory and recognition for the symbols when they were paired with their correct Jungian archetypal meaning.
Even if they didn't consciously know the meaning.
Exactly. Like, they'd remember the diamond shape better if it had been presented alongside the word self, its supposed archetype, than if it had been paired with some random word, even if the self connection seemed totally obscure to them consciously.
Huh. So that suggests what? Some kind of pre-existing resonance?
It suggests there might be a deeper cognitive fit or preference in our brains for these specific symbol meaning connections operating below the level of conscious awareness, a kind of pre-structuring.
That's definitely intriguing evidence, but
Yeah.
let's bring in the counter-argument, because this is where it gets really debated, isn't it? The whole issue of proof.
Oh, yeah. The major challenge.
The philosopher Karl Popper's ideas about science are relevant here, right? The falsifiability problem. Ray Scott Percival, a critic, really hammered Jung on this.
He did. Percival argued that Jung's biggest claims about the collective unconscious, especially the more metaphysical ones, simply aren't testable. You can't devise an experiment that could disprove them. And if you can't disprove something, Popper would say, it's not really scientific.
So it might be interesting philosophy, but not empirical science.
That's the critique. Jung insisted the collective unconscious was inherited biological part of our nature.
But Percival and others push back on that leap, don't they? They say, okay, maybe there are common mental structures, common symbols across humanity.
Right.
But why do we need to invoke some mysterious inherited psychic layer? Couldn't it just be common environments? Shared nurture rather than shared nature?
Explain that argument a bit more.
Well, think about it. Every single human being, everywhere, throughout history, experiences certain fundamental things. We all get hungry. We all need shelter. We all experience parents or caregivers. We all see the sun rise and set, experience night and day, the changing seasons.
Basic human condition stuff.
Exactly. So isn't it perfectly logical that all human minds grappling with these identical universal experiences would independently develop similar mental structures, similar symbols, similar stories to make sense of it all?
So we don't need inherited archetypes to explain why everyone has a mother figure concept, because everyone literally has some kind of mothering experience.
Right. We don't need ancestral psychic ghosts. We just need a gravity, biology, and the shared reality of being human on Earth. Seems like a much simpler explanation, doesn't it? Occam's razor, maybe?
It's a very powerful critique, and it's one analytical psychology constantly has to grapple with. The defense usually relies on the sheer specificity and complexity of some of the parallels.
Like the Mithras liturgy image?
Exactly. The common environment argument might explain broad themes why everyone cares about heroes or villains or mothers, but does it explain the spontaneous appearance of something as bizarre and specific as a sunfallis causing wind in completely disconnected contexts?
That's harder to explain away with just shared experience.
With Jung, the detail was the key. The intricate, often obscure nature of the symbols pointed beyond just common life experiences towards something deeper, something already structured, pre-programmed. But the debate definitely continues.
And this whole concept, it's not just about individual therapy, is it? Jung saw the collective unconscious playing out on a massive scale. In society, in politics.
Oh, hugely important for him. Because if we all share this unconscious layer, it means groups, societies, nations share it too. And that makes them incredibly vulnerable to political manipulations through symbols.
How so?
Jung was writing during the rise of fascism, remember? He was deeply disturbed by mass movements. He saw them as functioning like mass psychoses. Individuals in a crowd, he argued, can lose their personal consciousness, their critical thinking, and regress to this deeper collective level. They start channeling powerful, often primitive, unconscious symbolism archetypes through the mob mentality and through the figure of the charismatic leader.
So the leader taps into these ancient symbols to sway the masses.
Precisely. The leader becomes a hook for projections of the hero archetype, or the savior, or maybe the shadow. People stop thinking for themselves and become part of this mass man, swept along by unconscious currents. It was a terrifying prospect for him.
That really puts a different spin on political symbols and rhetoric. It also explains why Jung kept seeing these symbols pop up again and again, even when society thought it had moved past them. Like his analysis of UFOs.
Ah, yes, the flying saucers. That's a fascinating late work of his. He studied the whole phenomenon, the sightings, the rumors, the cultural impact, and he called it a living myth.
A living myth, meaning it wasn't necessarily real aliens, but something psychological.
He didn't really care if the objects themselves were physically real or not. What interested him was why people were seeing them and why they took that specific form. He argued that modern, rational, technological society tries to suppress these powerful ancient images from the collective unconscious, especially the old God images.
But they don't stay suppressed.
No, they inevitably find a way to resurface, but they come back in a modern disguise. In this case, a technological one, the flying saucer.
And the shape was important to him, wasn't it? The roundness.
Absolutely critical. The circle or sphere is perhaps the most universal symbol of wholeness, integration, completion. It's the symbol of the self-archetype, the totality of the psyche.
So seeing these round objects in the sky was the psyche demanding wholeness.
Exactly. Jung saw it as a compensatory sign. Our modern world felt increasingly fragmented, split-minded, as he put it. The psyche, seeking balance, spontaneously projected this ancient symbol of unity and totality onto the heavens, onto these mysterious objects. It was a collective dream, a modern myth expressing an ancient need.
That's a really different way to look at something like UFOs. Okay, so we've seen the theory, the evidence, the critiques, the social implications. How does this all get used in actual therapy? What's the goal?
Well, in analytical psychology, a big part of the work is engaging directly with these unconscious forces, these archetypes, as they manifest in a person's life.
Manifest how? Like in projections onto people?
Exactly. A major goal is to help the patient differentiate the archetype from the real person carrying the projection, to sort of peel the symbol off the individual.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Let's say you have an incredibly difficult, overpowering relationship with your father. He seems like this absolute tyrant. In therapy, you might explore how much of that reaction is purely about him, the actual man, and how much is an unconscious projection of the powerful tyrannical progenitor archetype onto him.
Ah, so you're reacting not just to Dad, but to this ancient inherited image of the scary father figure.
Precisely. And by recognizing that archetypal energy, by understanding its impersonal collective nature, you can start to disentangle it from your personal relationship with your actual father. You see him more clearly as just a human being.
And that leads to healthier relationships.
That's the aim. Less unconscious projection, more conscious relating. It takes the overwhelming charge out of it sometimes.
Okay, so wrapping this all up, it feels like there are fundamentally two ways people tend to view the collective unconscious, even among Jungians, a kind of basic version and a more cosmic one.
That's a good way to put it. Scholars often talk about a minimalist versus a maximalist interpretation.
What's the minimalist take?
The minimalist view stays closer to biology and clinical observation. It sees the collective unconscious simply as a set of inherited, species-specific psychological structures, basic predispositions, like the psychological equivalent of us all inheriting the basic bone structure of an arm.
So just the fundamental wiring we all share because we're human.
Pretty much. Enabling common behaviors, common ways of perceiving the world. It's the collective arm analogy. We all have the same basic mental toolkit.
And the maximalist view.
That's the interpretation Jung himself seemed increasingly drawn to, especially later in life. It embraces the more numinous, even mystical quality of these experiences. Meaning it sees the archetypes and the collective unconscious not just as biological structures, but as potential evidence of something more, a connection maybe to a larger reality, a divine mind, or a world soul, the anima mundi. It suggests a level of psychic reality that transcends the individual and connects us all in a more profound, perhaps even spiritual way.
So that view really leans into the metaphysical possibilities.
It does. It takes the universality of these psychic patterns as hinting at a deeper, unified consciousness underlying everything.
So Jung really left us with this revolutionary and kind of challenging concept, this idea that we carry the whole psychic history of our species within us. It's clinical, it's psychological, but it pushes right up against philosophy and metaphysics.
Absolutely. It forces you to question how much of your own inner world, your dreams, your attractions, your fears, is truly yours, and how much is the echo of millennia of human experience.
Right. So as you, our listener, reflect on this deep dive, here's something to maybe chew on, building on what we've discussed. Jung argued these archetypes are constantly shaping how you see the world, how you react emotionally, even how you respond politically.
Hmm.
So the question for you is, when you encounter a really powerful symbol, maybe a national flag, a religious icon, maybe even just a shape, or when you feel this sudden, overwhelming, almost inexplicable emotional connection or repulsion towards someone, are you just having a unique personal reaction?
Whoa.
Or are you maybe unknowingly tapping into and channeling the ancient psychic life of the past? Which parts of your own life, your relationships, your strong reactions, might actually be you living out one of these incredibly old, inherited, universal symbols without even realizing it?
It's a profound question to ask yourself.
Definitely something to think about. Thank you for joining us as we explore the depths of Jung's inherited mind. We really encourage you to dig into the sources yourself and keep exploring these ideas. Until next time.
Welcome back to the deep dive. You know how we do it here. We take these dense, complex reports, we dig in, and we pull out the essential knowledge you need. Today, we're tackling a really significant piece of work. It's a comprehensive, multi-hazard assessment looking at current and future risks across Europe. We're talking about a report built on some serious expert analysis covering, I think, 47 different kinds of threats. It's a lot. Our mission, for you listening, is to really cut through all that detail. We want to pinpoint the most critical findings, where are the threats getting worse, and maybe more importantly, how do these risks connect in ways that could cause, well, real systemic problems.
Absolutely. And I think to really grasp the weight of the findings, you need to understand just how rigorous the source material is. This wasn't just rehashing old ideas. It was a highly structured collaborative effort. They called it a knowledge mapping exercise. Over 50 specialists involved from the Joint Research Center, that's the JRC, the EU science arm, and also experts from DG ECHOS, which handles emergency response.
Right, the JRC and ECHO. So the people who really live and breathe this stuff day in, day out.
Exactly. And they built this whole assessment around what they call an all hazards and all of society approach.
Okay, all hazards. Let's break that down. Does that mean literally everything?
Pretty much anything that could cause widespread harm. So yeah, pandemics, cyber attacks, floods, heat waves, but also things maybe less obvious like, say, extreme space weather, solar flares, disrupting technology. It's a very wide net.
Okay, got it. So they looked at everything. After all that intense work, drilling down into 47 risks. What's the big headline, the single most crucial takeaway for Europe over the next decade? What should really be grabbing policymakers' attention right now?
Well, the central finding is quite stark. While Europe has certainly dealt with some very costly disasters in the past, the analysis shows a clear, increasing trend in the potential impact for the next 10 years.
An increasing trend. Okay, that's worrying in itself.
It is. But here's the really critical part, the insight that changes the game. The biggest growth and potential impact isn't expected to come from the immediate physical damage. It's projected to come from the indirect consequences.
Okay, let's pause right there. Indirect consequences. That feels like it flips the whole script on how we usually think about disasters, doesn't it?
It really does.
Because, historically, when a disaster strikes a flood, an earthquake, we focus on the visible stuff, the collapsed bridge, the flooded homes, the direct physical damage. That's what hits the news.
That's the immediate picture, yes.
But you're saying that's no longer the primary concern going forward.
Yeah.
That these indirect impacts are actually becoming the bigger threat. What makes them so much worse than what we've seen before?
It's about the complexity, the interconnectedness of modern society, and the sheer ripple effect. The direct physical damage, while still devastating, is increasingly being overshadowed by this unseen, domino effect. We're talking about things like massive business interruptions. Think about supply chains grinding to a halt.
Right, one factory floods somewhere and suddenly car parts are missing halfway across the continent.
Exactly. Or long-term societal consequences that are incredibly difficult to even measure straight away. Impacts on mental health, displacement, loss of trust. The analysis strongly suggests that in the future, these indirect losses are set to far outweigh the more easily quantifiable physical damages.
So it's like the initial shock, the hammer blow, might be survivable for the system as a whole.
Yeah.
But it's the long, slow bleed, the economic disruption, the social strain that really poses the bigger, more insidious danger.
That captures it very well. And this trend, this rise of indirect impacts, it's not uniform across all risks. It's particularly pronounced in certain categories.
Which ones specifically?
So the report highlights biological hazards, think pandemics, antimicrobial resistance, environmental risks like pollution events or biodiversity loss, technological disruptions, which is a huge category, and of course, cyber threats.
Okay, so bio, environmental, tech, cyber. What connects those? Why are they the ones driving these indirect costs?
Because they disproportionately hit our interconnected systems. Things like critical infrastructure, power grids, communication networks, water supplies, global commerce, financial systems, and crucially, health services. Think about it. A major cyber attack might cause almost zero direct physical damage. No buildings fall down. But if it cripples hospital networks across multiple regions for days or weeks...
The human cost, the economic cost from lost productivity, the long-term health impacts, yeah, it would be astronomical, far beyond any physical damage metric.
Precisely. The indirect consequences cascade outwards.
You know, what's fascinating here is how this challenges our traditional risk perception. We often rate risks based on historical losses, right? What's caused the most damage in the past.
That's been the standard approach, yes.
But this report flags things like, you mentioned sophisticated AI threats or maybe major space weather events, things where we have very limited historical loss data, maybe none at all. Yet they project potentially massive future impacts.
Exactly. And why? Precisely because of those cascading indirect consequences we were just talking about. Their potential to disrupt deeply embedded systems is immense, even if they haven't happened on a large scale yet.
It really signals that our old risk models, the ones based purely on looking backward, are, well, they're becoming fundamentally inadequate, aren't they?
Inadequate is a good word. We're trying to assess threats that, in some cases, simply didn't exist in their current form even a decade ago, or threats whose context has completely changed.
Which leads us perfectly into this idea of the new threat landscape. If historical data isn't enough anymore, what are these new or newly dangerous threats we need to wrap our heads around? The report seems to split them into emerging risks and high-impact, low-probability HILP events. Let's tackle emerging risks first. What defines those?
Right. So an emerging risk isn't necessarily something brand new under the sun. It could be, but it can also be a risk that's just incredibly difficult to assess using our standard methods. Maybe the data is lacking or the dynamics are changing too fast. Or it could be a familiar risk, like a flood, but appearing under completely unfamiliar and much more dangerous conditions, maybe interacting with other stressors.
And technology seems to be a massive driver here.
Huge driver, absolutely.
Okay, give us the top examples from the report. What should be on our radar?
Well, artificial intelligence risks are definitely high on the list. The sheer potential there is, well, it's broad. You have risks from accidental misuse, unintended consequences spiraling out of control, cybersecurity vulnerabilities inherent in complex AI systems.
And the terrifying one, the potential loss of human control over highly capable AI models.
That's certainly part of the spectrum of concern. The challenge is assessment. The technology is evolving at such an exponential rate. It's incredibly hard to model future failure modes accurately.
Okay, AI is one. What else?
Another really key area highlighted is the intersection of technology and climate change. Specifically, something called NATEC.
NATEC.
Yeah, it stands for Natural Hazard Triggering Technological Disasters.
Okay, so like you mentioned before, a natural event, say a massive storm, causing a secondary industrial accident, a chemical spill, a plant explosion.
Precisely that. And the reason it's flagged as emerging is because climate change is fundamentally altering the frequency and intensity of the triggers. We're seeing more extreme hydrometeorological events, intense rainfall, coastal storm surges, rapid flooding. That means a higher probability of, say, floodwaters breaching containment at an industrial facility or extreme heat causing critical cooling systems to fail. The underlying risk is growing because the natural hazard landscape itself is changing rapidly.
Right, the triggers becoming more common and more powerful.
Exactly, and it's not just new tech or tech-related risks. Even some very old, familiar natural hazards are now shifting into this emerging category.
Which ones? I thought we had a decent handle on things like fires and droughts.
Well, that's the point. We thought we did, based on historical patterns. But the report classifies droughts and wildfires as emerging risks now.
Why? Just because they're happening more often?
It's more than just frequency. It's the intensity, the scale, and the sheer unpredictability, all fundamentally driven by climate change. Fire seasons are starting earlier, lasting longer, burning hotter, and appearing in regions that rarely saw major fires before. Droughts are becoming more severe, multi-year events in some areas. The conditions have changed so dramatically that decades-old patterns and models are no longer reliable guides. We're operating in unfamiliar territory, which makes managing them, predicting them, deeply challenging. That's what pushes them to the emerging classification.
Okay, that makes sense. The rule book has been torn up,
Yeah.
essentially. So that covers the new, the unpredictable, the hard-to-assess risks. Now let's pivot to the other category you mentioned, HILP events, high impact, low probability. These are the ones we tend to think of as, the black swans. The truly catastrophic but hopefully very rare events, things like extreme solar storms knocking out satellites and power grids, maybe major nuclear incidents or complex pandemic outbreaks, far worse than what we've experienced recently.
Yes, those are classic examples. Events that are statistically rare, maybe haven't happened in recorded history or only centuries ago, but if they did happen, the impact could be society-altering, potentially civilization-level threats. However, there's a really serious, really urgent point the report makes about one specific subset of these HILP risks, and that relates to Earth system tipping points, ESTPs.
Right, the big ones. Things like the collapse of major ice sheets, shifts in ocean currents like the AMSC, dieback of rainforests, these large-scale, potentially irreversible changes to the planet's fundamental operating systems.
Exactly those. And here's the most sobering message from this analysis. We can no longer comfortably categorize all ESTPs as low-likelihood events. That P in HILP, the probability is changing, and it's changing quickly for some of them.
So, wait. You're saying the report indicates some of these planet-scale tipping points are moving from the realm of maybe someday far in the future to potentially much sooner.
The analysis is stark. It strongly suggests that at least 5 of the 16 globally identified tipping points are facing a serious risk of crossing irreversible, destabilizing barriers if global average temperatures rise above 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial levels.
1.5 degrees,
Yeah.
which is the threshold we're already dangerously close to or potentially breaching temporarily.
Precisely. Which means these aren't just theoretical risks for future centuries anymore.
Wow, okay, I think we really need to let that sink in for a moment. Risks that many people, maybe even policymakers, might have dismissed as almost science fiction, things potentially thousands of years away. You're saying the science is now indicating they are becoming near-term, urgent concerns.
That's the implication. They require immediate, targeted risk assessment. We need much better foresight tools, much more sophisticated monitoring. Because their impacts aren't gradual or linear, they could be abrupt, massive, and fundamentally irreversible. You can't just manage the consequences of a collapsed AMOC. You have to prevent crossing the threshold in the first place.
So, just to summarize where we are, we've got new risks emerging constantly, especially from tech and climate interactions. We've got familiar risks like fire behaving in dangerously unfamiliar ways. And now, the truly catastrophic planetary scale risks are potentially moving much closer to the present day than we thought.
That's a fair summary of the shifting landscape, yes.
The inescapable conclusion here seems to be, well, that everything is connected. Which brings us to the systemic nature of risk and what the report calls cascading effects. Can you unpack that? How does an initial failure ripple outwards?
This really gets to the heart of the challenge for modern societies. A cascading effect is essentially when an initial shock or failure could be a natural disaster. A tech outage, a pandemic wave triggers a sequence of disruptions across multiple interconnected human subsystems. One domino knocks over the next, then the next. When the experts involved in this report mapped out all those 47 different risks, they didn't just look at the risks in isolation. They specifically analyzed which human systems were most frequently impacted across all those different types of threats.
So looking for the common vulnerability points, the places where modern European society is most fragile.
Exactly. Identifying the weakest links in the chain, you could say?
And what did they find? Which sectors consistently show up as being vulnerable to the widest range of threats?
The results are quite clear and probably won't surprise listeners entirely, but the scale is revealing. The top 3 most frequently impacted subsystems are, number 1, economic disruption. That was found to be affected by nearly 40 of the risks they analyzed.
Nearly 40 out of 47. Wow. So almost any major crisis hits the economy.
Almost guaranteed. Tied very closely is number 2, human health. Also impacted by nearly 40 risks.
Okay, economy and health. Makes sense. What's number 3?
Disruption of essential services. This includes things like power, water, communications, transport. This category was impacted by approximately 30 of the risks studied.
So the takeaway is a major shock hits. Doesn't really matter what kind of shock. Could be a flood, a heat wave, a cyber attack, a pandemic. And it's almost certain to simultaneously damage the economy, overwhelm health systems, and compromise critical infrastructure like power and communications.
That's the systemic vulnerability laid bare. The interconnectedness means shocks propagate widely and hit multiple vital areas at once.
Let's make this really concrete for people listening. Can we use a real-world example from the report that shows how a seemingly single hazard can rapidly spiral into one of these complex, multi-hazard, cascading crises?
Absolutely. The report uses the recent compound disaster in Greece as a very potent case study. You might remember there were devastating wildfires.
Yes, huge fires. Very destructive.
Followed very quickly by truly catastrophic flooding from Storm Daniel. Now, the analysis connects these dots. Exceptionally high sea surface temperatures in the Mediterranean, a direct consequence of climate change, fueled the extreme torrential rainfall associated with Storm Daniel.
So climate change amplified the storm's power.
Significantly, this led to unprecedented flooding, particularly in the Thessaly region, which is a major agricultural area for Greece. So immediate impact. Agriculture wiped out. That's a huge economic hit.
Right, the economic disruption box is tits.
Then the floodwaters caused severe damage to infrastructure, roads, bridges, buildings. This led to mass displacement of people from their homes and completely shut down essential services in large areas. Power, water, everything.
Yeah, essential services, disruption, displacement. That's ticking more boxes.
And the combination of the preceding fires and the subsequent floods created a widespread sense of public insecurity, stress on emergency services, and long-term recovery challenges. You see how it started with maybe wildfires and then heavy rain, but it rapidly evolved into a complex, intertwined crisis hitting the economy, infrastructure, public health, social stability. That is a perfect, tragic illustration of a cascading effect in action.
That Greece example really drives it home. It shows exactly why the old way of thinking, the fire department just plans for fires, the water utility just plans for floods, everyone stays in their own silo, is completely obsolete now. It doesn't work when the reality is interconnected chaos.
It's dangerously inadequate for the world we live in now.
Okay, so if the future is systemic, if these cascading effects are the norm, what are the current roadblocks? What structural gaps did the report identify that are preventing Europe from building genuine systemic resilience?
Well, the report points to significant gaps on the policy side of things. One major issue is still insufficient investment in risk prevention. There's often a bias towards reactive measures dealing with the disaster after it happens, rather than proactive investment to reduce the risk beforehand.
So spending money cleaning up the mess instead of reinforcing the foundations.
In essence, yes. Another critical point is the limited mainstreaming of what's called disaster risk management, or DRM, into other policy areas. Risk management can't just be a separate box ticked by emergency planners.
It needs to be baked into everything else.
Exactly. It needs to be fundamentally integrated into climate adaptation strategies, into how we plan our cities, into national economic policy, into infrastructure investment decisions. It has to be part of the DNA of governance, not an add-on.
And what about coordination? Especially since many of these risks don't respect borders.
That's another key policy gap identified. The need for enhanced cross-border coordination. Developing truly coordinated prevention strategies and response efforts between neighboring countries is still a major work in progress for many types of transboundary risks, like river floods or industrial accidents near borders.
Okay, so those are some big policy challenges. What about on the ground? The practical, operational side of risk management, are there gaps there too?
Oh, definitely. Operationally, a persistent and major challenge is data, or rather the lack of adequate data.
Data. In what sense?
The report highlights inadequate data collection, monitoring, and especially sharing across several vital risk areas. For example, getting good, localized, real-time flood data is still a problem in many places. Tsunami monitoring networks have gaps. And a particularly concerning area mentioned is tracking cyber incidents, especially within sensitive sectors like healthcare. Without reliable, standardized, shareable data, effective planning, early warning, and rapid response become incredibly difficult, if not impossible.
You can't manage what you can't properly measure or see coming.
Precisely. And beyond data, there are also ongoing challenges with implementation. Even when good policies or plans exist on paper, actually executing them fully and effectively on the ground across different administrative levels often faces significant hurdles, resources, capacity, political will.
So the picture is, we know the risks are becoming more complex and interconnected, but our policies, our data systems, and sometimes our implementation are lagging behind that reality.
That's a fair assessment of the core challenge.
Which means the solution can't just be incremental tinkering. It sounds like it requires that radical shift. The report advocates for this integrated all hazards and all of society approach. How do we actually do that? How does the report suggest we mobilize everyone needed?
It emphasizes that this can't be just a government job. Achieving true resilience requires actively engaging every major societal actor. That means public institutions at all levels, national, regional, local. It means academic and research bodies bringing their knowledge. It absolutely means the private sector, which owns and operates so much critical infrastructure.
And civil society, too.
Crucially, yes. Civil society organizations, community groups, individual citizens, everyone has a role to play. Resilience needs to become a truly shared responsibility, a collective goal embedded across society.
Okay, so it's a whole system effort. What specific, actionable steps does the report prioritize right now to start building that kind of resilience effectively? Where should the focus be?
The recommendations cluster around three key areas. First, there's a strong call to invest heavily in multi-hazard, data-driven forecasting and early warning systems. We need to get much better at anticipating these complex compound risks before they hit, not just reacting afterwards.
Using data and modeling to see the cascades coming.
Yes, moving towards predictive capabilities for interconnected threats. Second, the report stresses the need to focus on what it terms smart investments. This particularly means investing in climate-resilient infrastructure.
So not just building new stuff, but making sure it can withstand the future shocks we know are coming. Retrofitting existing systems.
Exactly. Building roads, power lines, water systems, buildings that are designed for future climate conditions and other hazards is ultimately far more cost-effective than repeatedly paying for disaster recovery and reconstruction.
Makes sense. What's the third area?
The third is circling back to that critical issue of data. Data availability, quality, and especially sharing mechanisms must be dramatically enhanced. And importantly, this isn't just about traditional disaster data like rainfall or river levels. It includes integrating economic data, geopolitical intelligence, insights from horizon scanning activities, basically, pulling in signals from much further afield to spot the next potential emerging threat or vulnerability before it fully materializes. We need to broaden our information inputs way beyond the traditional disaster risk management box.
So better foresight through better, broader data, smarter investments in resilience, and getting everyone involved. That seems to be the path forward.
That encapsulates the core strategic direction, yes.
Yeah. This has been a really insightful deep dive. I think you've truly clarified this fundamental shift in Europe's risk landscape. We're moving away from the era of relatively predictable, localized disasters
towards a future dominated by systemic, interconnected, often transboundary threats.
Right, where the real, often hidden danger lies in those indirect, cascading consequences that ripple through our economy, our health systems, our essential services.
And where risks we once considered incredibly rare or very far off, like those Earth system tipping points, are now demanding urgent attention.
It paints a challenging picture, definitely.
It does, and that actually leads us to one final, maybe provocative thought for you, the listener, to consider as you digest all this. We've talked about risks that operate on vastly different timescales, haven't we? A flood might last days, an economic downturn months or years, but things like the potential destabilization of major Earth systems, the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, the AMOC ocean current system, for instance, these operate on timescales, potentially ranging from decades to centuries to play out fully, though the tipping point itself could be crossed much sooner.
Right, the really long-term, potentially irreversible changes.
Exactly. So here's the question. Is the most catastrophic, game-changing risks involve these long-term planetary scale shifts requiring sustained global action over decades? How effective can our current risk management systems truly be? Especially when our policies, our political cycles, our funding decisions typically operate on much shorter time horizons, maybe 4 or 5 years, election to election.
That's a deeply uncomfortable question. How do you manage a century-scale risk with a 4-year plan?
It forces us to confront a fundamental challenge, doesn't it? How do we actually govern anticipation itself? How do we build political and societal mechanisms capable of acting effectively on long-term existential threats that operate far beyond typical planning cycles? Something to really think about.